Hello and welcome to another episode of the Tyndale House podcast. We are in season 4 of the podcast, which is our second series looking at names in the Bible and the ancient world. And we are looking today at the question of genealogies, of which there are quite a few in the Bible, as you may have noticed. So I'm joined again by Caleb Howard, who heads up our Old Testament research team here at Tyndale House and is an Assyriologist, and James Bejon, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge and a reader here at Tyndale House and is also part of the Old Testament research team. Good morning, gentlemen. Good to have you with us again.
Again, yes, good.
Another exciting discussion ahead. So tell us about genealogies. The Bible has quite a few. Do you know how many?
Depends on how you define a genealogy.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, I've not counted them myself, so it wasn't a trick question. I just wondered whether you knew off the top of your head.
I feel like I should know.
Yeah, right. Well, there's homework for the listeners. My understanding is that the Bible has an unusual interest in genealogies compared to other literature from the ancient world. So, Caleb, do you want to start us off just reflecting a little bit on that? Obviously, we don't want to talk about it for too long, but is there a difference between the Bible's interest in genealogies and that in say, Assyria? And why might that be?
Yeah, so I think it's worth thinking about genealogies or lists of things as existing for certain purposes. So you don't just produce a list just for no reason. And when you look at the list in the ancient world, you can often discern the purpose, either because there's some note attached to the list saying this is a list of such and such whatever group of people. And so if you bear that in mind, you can see that the different lists in the Bible and also in the ancient Near East have different purposes and presumably reflect a social context for those lists. So I agree with you that the Bible has a unique interest in genealogy. It's possible that we have, let's say, less lists than you might imagine per given number of texts in Mesopotamia, say, because there was less interest in genealogy and family relationships, or it's possible that records like that were kept and we don't have them. Okay. They might have been kept through memory. People knew their family members and so on and kept them in that way. So bearing in mind that the texts don't necessarily reflect the reality of sort of how people kept track of things. If you look at the list of people in the Bible, the genealogies of people in the Bible, we can talk about the definition of genealogy in a minute. I think it's worth doing. I think they are kept for particular reasons, and we can talk about that in a moment. So a good example of that would be inheritance concerns. Mm-hmm. So if you read the book of Joshua, for example, it's clear that allotments of land were given to certain tribes. And if you wanted to know whether you had a share in that allotment, you would need to know what tribe you were from.
And that issue becomes important again in, say, Nehemiah, when people are returning from exile and some people can't serve as priests or Levites because they can't demonstrate that they are in the line. Yeah,
that's right.
Great.
And in the Jubilee cycle.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
In the list of names that I'm aware of in the ancient Near East, for me, particularly Mesopotamia, I'm not thinking so much of Egypt or Anatolia. They tend to be for other reasons. So maybe the best known example from Mesopotamia of a list of names or a genealogy would be the Assyrian king list, which gives at least the impression of an unbroken line of Assyrian kings going back to the early 2nd millennium BC, over 100 names. And it seems likely that at least from a king called Adasi in the first half of the 2nd millennium BC, there was a more or less unbroken line of kings. Not from father to son necessarily. It's clear that you didn't have to be the son of the previous king to be king, but at least within the same family. And it seems that list was meant to both kind of project that sense of continuity over time, but also kind of keep track of, it reflects consideration of records from royal inscriptions to lists of years, calendars, and so on of kings to establish the number of years that kings reigned and that sort of thing. So it had at least partly an ideological purpose, an ideological goal. So you can see there that there's a reason for keeping the list. And that reason appears to be different than the name list that we have in the Bible. Those have different aims. They're driven by different things. I think it's important to keep in mind difference as well as continuity when we compare these things. Just because you see genealogy in the title of an article that publishes an ancient tablet with lists of names doesn't necessarily mean it's the same thing as we find in Genesis, say, or Chronicles.
Yeah, sure. That's very, very helpful introduction. You said we should touch on the definition of a genealogy.
Yeah.
So my very basic definition of a genealogy is that it's a list of parents and children going down through the generations. Is it more complicated than that?
That's the essence of all of them, isn't it? A distinction often made, which I think is a helpful one, is, and this brings us to the difference between the Bible and other sources, is the distinction between what people call a linear genealogy and a segmented genealogy. So linear, I sometimes call vertical. A fathered B, fathered C, fathered D. So you're just tracing a single family line down. So from Adam to Noah, or from Noah to Abraham, whoever. Segmented, which I sometimes call horizontal, is sort of A had 6 sons who were B, C, D, E, F, G, if that was 6. And then it will zoom in often on one of those. It will then explore the family tree of B and then next of C. And not necessarily doing all of them, but the idea of that seems to be, as far as I can tell, sort of charting out theologically, if you like, how a father is filling out a particular geographical area. So a classic example would be the Table of Nations. We often call it the Table of Nations, don't we? But actually, it's just a genealogy. It's a list of sons as far as the text is concerned.
This is Genesis 10.
Yes, sorry, yeah. And so this is showing how Noah's sons, Shem, Ham and Japheth, are giving rise to other nations and sort of filling out the world around the biblical story,
Right. And so that's an example of a segmented or a horizontal genealogy, because we look at each son in turn and their descendants. Yeah.
And that is what, to my knowledge at least, is very unique to Scripture. You get it a little bit in late Arabic works and so on, but even there, people are largely trying to reconstruct genealogies and reconstruct segmented genealogies. And you can do that. I've done that with quite a lot of old Arabic inscriptions, taken a lot of sort of linear genealogies and compiled them into horizontal ones. But the Bible actually sets out to document these horizontal genealogies, and that seems very unique to me.
So what's behind that?
Well, partly the geographical issue, that's Genesis 10. But you can see it also in, for example, highlighting a particular character. So in Exodus 3, for example, Exodus 6, for example, we have this genealogy of Moses and Aaron, right? And it starts out at the beginning of Jacob's sons and goes down to Levi and then fleshes out Moses and Aaron's genealogy and stops. We don't get the rest of Jacob's sons. Yep. So that seems to be an example of highlighting these characters. And then the text continues. This was the Moses and Aaron who were speaking to Pharaoh and leading the people of Israel out of slavery and so on. So the idea in that case is to highlight a character. In Genesis, pretty much every major character gets a genealogy. In Genesis, they're called toledotes, right? The generations of. These are the generations of. And the book of Genesis is kind of structured around these 10 toledote lists. They're not always lists, actually. Sometimes you get, or often you get, this is the toledote, this is the generations of Terah, these are the generations of Shem or whatever. And sometimes those are followed by genealogies. In other cases, they're followed by the stories about the children of that character, of that person. This is a digression, but it's one of the curious things there is that the first toledote is Genesis 2:4, referring to the heavens and the earth. This is the generations of the heavens and the earth. That doesn't seem to be about descendants in an obvious way. Yeah. I mean, maybe you disagree, but it seems to me that is an extension of the idea of toledote to a kind of history notion, story about the past kind of notion. So, there is the the fact that Adam descends from God, in a sense. He bears the image of God, and then he produces Seth, who is in his own image, and so on. So, but that's true, that's clear. But I think that even with people, when people are given a genealogy and it's sort of headed by Toledot, it's not just the family relationships that matter. It's the stories about the family. It's the stories about the people in the family and how they relate to the overall plot of Scripture.
Yeah, great. So we have these genealogies for theological purposes. The Bible is not just random collection of stuff. We believe, the three of us here, as we believe in Tyndale House, that God is behind Scripture and is the ultimate author of it. So God wants us to have these genealogies for some reason. Yet it can be quite hard work when you hit the beginning of Chronicles or whatever, and you've just got all of these people and lists. And why do we really need this?
I mean, lots of Chronicles is drawing on earlier material, isn't it? And so a lot of it already appears in Genesis, some in Exodus, some in other books, and the Chronicle is bringing that together. And in answer to the question why we've got it in these earlier books, I think part of the point is just the fundamentally interconnected nature of the biblical narrative. I mean, the Bible is a remarkable book, uniquely in ancient literature. It's giving us this coherent narrative, a kind of continuous flow over time where you can go all the way from Adam, counting years if you want to, all the way up at least to the exile with no real blank spots in it. Right. You know, you've got the odd little black box, if you like, between sort of Exodus 1:1 and what follows, you know, where you've got kind of this long period in Egypt where almost a curtain is drawn over it. But even that in Chronicles is connected up with genealogies. And so part of the purpose is that when you meet characters in Scripture, you've normally got a background against which we can put them. And so when Israel appear in the land and they get raided by the Midianites or something, you can say, well, I know these people, you know, these descend from Abraham. Right. And so they're related to the promise, but not directly inheritors of it. And so they're sort of stealing their being numerous rather than Israel. And you can put together things. And so, yeah, there's a context to everything, isn't there, in Scripture? And the genealogies are kind of fundamentally what will create that.
That's really helpful. Do you want to talk about some specific genealogies?
Do you want to talk about some specific genealogies?
Well, let's pick one that I think is kind of a helpful phenomenon and a surprising phenomenon of genealogies, which I was quite surprised at. So, I mean, I was looking just before we came at the way in which sometimes you can see two people, let's call them people, I think they refer to territories, but you can find sort of people who jump from one genealogy to another. And that might be odd to us, might kind of challenge our notion of a genealogy to some extent. So we thought about the table of nations. As I say, so it's Genesis 10, and they are sons, effectively. So in, 10 verse 7, we get the sons of Cush, so sons of Ethiopia, we commonly call that, and we get this lists, Sva, Vechevila, Vesefta, etc. And then it gets to this son, Ramah, and then afterwards, at the end of the verse, you get two further sons of Ramah, who are Sva and Dedan. Now, those are well-known countries. We call them countries that still exist in South Arabia now. And so it seems that they are sons of this place, Ramah. But then now, hopefully I can find it. Where is Keturah's, Genesis 25, in Keturah's genealogy, Abraham, or the writer is sort of going through, we get this initial list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sons, Zimran, Yokshan, and so forth. Then we sort of dive into, in verse 3, Yokshan's descendants, and they include these same two, Shava and Dedan. Now, it seems, therefore, that we've gone from sort of these two people countries being descendants of Ethiopia, if you like, to being descendants of Yokshan and of Keturah and of these, at least associated with these people who Genesis call sons of the East. And this is a kind of shift that we see in inscriptions. So Sabaic inscriptions refer to actually a region that sounds very much like Ramah as being in control of the kings of these two places, Shavar and Dedan. And so we do get them associated with Ethiopia in some very ancient texts. But then it seems that what's being reflected here is that these two territories, I'm going to call them, or, that Shavar and Dedan could have been their literal ancestors as well. I'm not averse to that. But it seems that what the text is reflecting is a later time where they're more closely associated with Keturah's descendants than they are with Ethiopia. And that kind of makes sense. I mean, they're situated across the Red Sea, and that area of Ethiopia has very strong links with the areas over in Saudi Arabia and South Arabia, rather, even to the extent of using the same scripts, having a material, cultural connection and so on. And it seems that at some point they're becoming more closely associated with kind of, the Keturaites than with the Ethiopians.
That's very interesting. But, so you're seeing these names in both of these genealogies as primarily places rather than people, but those are not incompatible. But it can't be that that Ramah is the father of the original Shavar and Dedan, and that Yokshan is. So how do we square that?
Yeah, exactly. And this is a way of squaring it. And I mean, an interesting thing to note is later in that verse in 25:3, we get Dedan referred to, and his sons include Ashurim, Letushim, Leumim. So these are plurals. These sound like they're describing groups of people rather than a individual son who had the name Ashurim. So there's sort of something to think about there. But I think more generally, there's the notion of kinship to think about. And so we're going to talk about lists possibly if I ever shut up and we get onto it. But in some lists of Ezra's list, for instance, people can be sons of Bethlehem.
Yes,
and they're inhabitants. And people can be daughters of Zion, let's say. This idea of kinship can be used quite flexibly. Someone can be a father of Gibeon if they're the founder of the town of Gibeon. And so I guess I'm seeing an oddity in these two, as you're saying, Ramah can't be the father of them and Yokshan be the father of them. So I'm seeing an oddity in the text. I'm then sort of thinking about some extra biblical references to these two territories. And then I'm thinking about the kind of generality of the biblical notion of a kinship and then putting together a possible account of what's happened.
Yeah. Okay, that's very helpful.
I mean, we're thinking about kind of social structure just a little bit, right? They clearly had this kind of segmented social structure, like the house of the father was a kind of basic aspect of that, Beit Av. And then that was part of a larger group, a clan, a mishpacha, I think is probably the term. And then kind of above that, you have tribes, Mater, Shevet, and then you have the people, the Am. Or in this case, or in many cases, the Bnei Israel, the sons of Israel. So at every level, that's thought about in kinship terms, not in sort of not purely, at least, in sort of nationalistic terms or political terms, but in kinship terms. And this is shot through the whole society. So when you think about these relationships, it feels like you can think about them corporately as well as individually. You can see that also in Genesis 10. In Genesis 10:15, right, it says Canaan brought forth Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth. But then in verse 16, it shifts to these gentilics, right, the Jebusite, the Amorite, the Girgashite, the Hivite, the Archite, the Sinite, and so on. And it gives the whole list as a series of what we call gentilics, all right, ites, Hivites, and so on. Not not referring to people as such. Or rather,
can you just define gentilics?
Yeah, referring to a people group.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. Right. Sorry. Yeah,
so like, the Ammonite as opposed to Ammon, the Moabite as opposed to Moab, and so on.
Yep.
That can be is actually the B'nai.
It can be framed as the sons of, right? Ammonite is often translated as such, but it's B'nai Ammon.
Yep.
Whereas in other cases you may have, I don't know if you do. Do you ever have Ammoni, Moabi?
I think you certainly never have Ammoni.
So you have this E on the end that indicates the same thing essentially as B'nai, sons.
Yes.
It indicates membership in a group, a collective.
You might have an Ammonitess, I think, among Solomon's wives. But I think that's probably the only exception.
Yeah. So all this list in 10:16, Genesis 10:16, has that E ending. Yebusi, the Jebusite, Amori, the Amorite, and so on. So it's all kind of related in kinship terms. And that's part of this genealogy. So when we read these genealogies, we have to recognize that corporate component is there. However you kind of work out the mechanics of its unfolding in history, it's there.
Yeah. So this is very helpful. So there's a corporate component that we need to include, at least sometimes. There may be some genealogies that are much more individualistic, for want of a better term. But some of these, particularly these earlier ones, are quite corporate, and the notion of fathering is a broader term, perhaps, or
corresponding to the corporate level.
It's evoking kinship in some sense. It's not necessarily about this person is this person's biological father, and we see that, don't we, in other places? So Belshazzar in Daniel 6, when the Queen Mother comes in, she talks about your father the king, referring to Nebuchadnezzar. But we know that Nebuchadnezzar was not Belshazzar's father, but he was his predecessor. You don't.
I suppose the father idea can have a broader sense. Yeah, I mean that's a tricky thing, but
it's a vexed example.
It is.
Yeah,
exactly.
All right, fair enough. Yeah.
But I mean, even in English thinking, you can refer to a sister town or a sister village or something like that, and in Chronicles, we get references to a particular territory, and then it will say something like Migra Sheha, and it's pasture lands, Uvenoteha, and its daughters, which presumably means it's satellite cities, villages, something like that.
There's actually a theory in anthropology and archaeology that talks about center and periphery, and the idea that there would be a central city that's often larger, often walled, and so on in the ancient world. And then little villages around it that are dependent upon it economically and socially and so on. And so I often take those daughter cities to be a bit like that. Sennacherib talks about the fact that he comes to Judah and takes over all these cities. And then he talks about little ones and big ones and you sort of think, well, and walled cities as well. So he's distinguished between types of cities. But so you can have this metaphor extended to all sorts of things. It's the sort of... There's a book by David Schloen called The House of the Father as Fact and Symbol. And he's getting at this very issue, right? In the ancient world, it was very common to use kinship terms, and the house of the father is a basic element of that as a way to think about all manner of things. And you could use it to you could even apply it to a nation state, kind of, or a state where the king is the father of everyone in the country.
Right.
So that metaphor is quite common.
One of the helpful things I think about that is I often used to read Chronicles and I would think to myself, well, there are perhaps almost 1 million Judaites or something. Why have we got this list in Chronicles and it's just picked out one particular guy who has 5 sons and then it's followed up some of those and not others? Like, what's the purpose of that? And arguably, it's not doing that. It's showing the organisation of Judah at a given point in time, and it's showing a 5-fold division into 5 major clans, etc. And sometimes you will get unusually conflicting genealogies in Chronic. I mean, we could jump into one of them if we've got. So, I mean, Benjamin is a nice example. So, if I can find it, so 1 Chronicles 7, is it? So we get in Numbers 26 a list of Benjamin's clans, and I think that there are 7 of them there. There are 2 sub-clans and 5 main clans. I'm looking for the sons of Benjamin somewhere. Verse 6 of 1 Chronicles 7, we get the Benjaminites, etc., Bela, Vecher, etc., 3. And so we've got sort of 3 clans mentioned there. But then if you go on to chapter 8, you have Benjamin in verse 1. He begets Bela, his firstborn, Ashbel, his secondborn, Achrach, his thirdborn. So they're numbered all the way up to a fifthborn, and so you've got this oddity. I mean, you can say it includes 2 extra people, but then why number them as 3 in 1 Chronicles 7, and why do we have different names? And I think a plausible reason is to say this is showing the organisation of Benjamin's clan, Benjamin's internal hierarchy, if you like, at 2 different points in time. Now, Benjamin's a slight outlier. Its clan structure changes more than most, but we've got a nice explanation of that in the narrative. Benjamin is almost entirely exterminated in the war with Gibeon, and I think there's 600 people left, aren't there? And then they have to get some sort of wives from elsewhere. Won't go into the detail, the dubious details of it all. There might be very good reasons, therefore, why Benjamin's tribe has gone through these quite different hierarchies and layouts over its history, because it's had this major kind of reworking and repopulation of its internal division. And
Interesting.
that view of a horizontal genealogy as charting out clans, I think can give some insight into what's going on here, and can make it feel a bit less arbitrary,
Yeah.
It's not picking out just random people.
I think that's one of the problems that many people have when reading these genealogies, that it sometimes feels that they come at a random point, full of random people, and what do we do with this? So this is very helpful. Yeah.
One thing to say maybe about just the overall function of these genealogies in Chronicles is very interesting. It should be worthwhile for listeners to sit down someday and just can use a Bible software or something like that and just read through 1 Chronicles 1 to 9, where you get these genealogies, and then find your way back to other parts of the Bible from which these names come. So you'll see, for example, that 1 Chronicles 1 is pretty much entirely based on genealogies in Genesis. It draws on genealogies in Genesis. And it needs to be specifically Genesis, not some other document, because it quotes Genesis at various points and modifies it and so on. It's really interesting the degree to which Chronicles depends on the rest of the Bible for its content. And if you continue reading then in Chronicles and then into Ezra and Nehemiah, you can see how important it was for, these would be people in the post-exilic period, people who had been in exile were coming back and so on. This is the period in which Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah were written. It was really important to have these lists of people. They were central to the whole return endeavor. So you mentioned earlier in Ezra and Nehemiah the importance of being able to establish one's family relationships, to be involved in the temple work among the Levites. I assume that the basis for that kind of search, to sort of go and find out who you were related to, would be the exact sorts of things you find in Ezra in 1 Chronicles 1 to 9. And in fact, it's really interesting in 1 Chronicles 9, in the end of the genealogies, which go through the tribes of Israel for the most part, and then key figures like Saul and the tribe of Judah leading to David and so on. Mm-hmm. It says there in 9:1, all Israel was registered in the genealogies, and behold, they're written on the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. And then these people were taken off to Babylon in exile for their unfaithfulness. And that's really important. It seems like that's referring to pre-exilic texts that contain these genealogies and on which these exilic period people were drawing when they were, I suppose, composing this book and also returning to the land. That matters historically because these people needed to return to the land under certain circumstances, but it also matters textually and how the text comes together. When we think about the relationship between, I remember what someone said to me once, why do we even have Chronicles in the Bible? We already have Samuel Kings, which is an utterly ridiculous thing to say. That's a terrible thing to say. If you feel like saying that ever, just assume you're wrong and ignorant and just read the Bible again, because it's there for a reason.
You really think about this.
And I want to do the same thing. But like they are different. One of the ways that they're different is that Chronicles draws in these genealogies.
Yeah, right.
It's really important. So I think part of it is probably establishing continuity between the pre-exilic people of Israel as it should have been. So Chronicles is very intent on calling Israel, Israel, not Israel and Judah.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
It does raise that sometimes and use that Israel-Judah distinction terminology sometimes. Most of the time, it just wants to talk about Israel as a reunified people group, presumably in fulfillment of the rest of the Old Testament and how God called his people and how his people came about. But the genealogies establish that, don't they? Right? Yeah. In very concrete terms.
Yeah. And in different ways, don't they? So fulfillment is, the word used. It's a good word, isn't it? I mean, you could think of 1 Chronicles 3, particularly, the long list of Israel's kings. That's a fulfillment of God's promise to give David a man on the throne, and it continues through the exile at the end of, so after the exile, the line continues. And so that's one of God's promises. 1 Chronicles 4 then looks to be far more geographical. It's charting out the various ways in which the people fill the land of Judah, the territory that God has given them. And you can see in certain places, I'm not sure if I can find one now, but what looks to be the fathering of towns and looks to be the kind of the... Where do we get the reference
verse 5? I'm not sure, the father of Tekoa. So we see Tekoa coming up later on.
Right. Mm-hmm. And so it's charting out something different there, and they're answering it in a sense to two different types of promise: the promise to give Israel the land, and the promise to give David a man on the throne.
Yeah, which all looks ahead to the New Testament too, doesn't it? We need to draw this conversation to a close. Any final thoughts on genealogies? Any final words for people who, when they're reading the Bible tomorrow, run into a genealogy and we want them to keep on going rather than skipping it?
Well, a thing that comes to mind is just the censuses in is that how you say the plural of census?
Yeah, that's fine.
I don't know. It's in numbers. See, I've just wasted time doing that. In numbers, right? And you have kind of clan leaders in that text, which may give some insight into how this kind of family relationship thing works. And then those are picked up on then later on in the genealogies in 1 Chronicles. So Nahshon, for example, is a leader in Judah, and he's cited as a chief, a leader, a ruler in Judah. So there are times where you can infer something of how the house of the father and the whole family relationships and how that's corporate and individual works out in individual cases like that. Yeah.
I think I'd say dig around in genealogies, see what you can find. You'll find some just interesting things. I mean, taking the numbers census as an example, if you put Genesis 46, so where it lists Jacob's 70 sons, grandsons, a lot of them, and if you put it next to Numbers 26 with the census, you'll find that not every son has gone on to be the head of a clan. And so Benjamin might have 10 sons in Genesis, he does have 10 sons in Genesis 46, but only 7 of them become clans. And if you divide the clan, the number of sons by the census number, so, 41,000 or something, so the total number for each tribe, Judah, let's say, if you sort of divide and work out the average size of a clan, then clans can be shown to be likely to survive according to their size. So basically, the larger the clan, the more likely it is to preserve its name over time. And you can find just a perfect correlation, the way it works out. And just digging around like that with numbers and lists of names, you'll find some nice things.
Brilliant. Gentlemen, thank you very much, James, Caleb, and come and join us again soon. Subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcast from. Please rate and review us because it really helps other people to know about what's going on. And go and read some genealogies. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.